lesson, I'm going to talk about how to read academic articles. So, you have an academic journal article now, a peer-reviewed academic source. They're difficult to find, but the good news is they're also difficult to read. So the big question is, how are you going to read this thing? As you start to read, the one thing is important to know: not all academic journal articles follow the same structure or format. There are several different kinds. Primarily, there are three different types of academic journal articles. There are empirical studies, literature reviews, and theory articles. It's important to understand what kind of article you have, because if you know what genre or what type of article you have, it'll help you understand how it's structured, and it'll help you read it more efficiently and more effectively. So, three kinds. Empirical studies are studies where the researcher conducts an experiment and then writes an article about what happened. That's probably what you imagine when you think of a scientific research article. The second kind, but that's not the only kind. The second kind is a literature review. This is an article that summarizes different empirical or theoretical studies on a particular topic or question, and the goal is to identify trends or draw conclusions from existing research. So essentially, in a literature review, what the writer does is they go and they read several empirical studies. They try to find all the empirical studies they can on a certain topic or a certain question, and then they try to put together the results of all those studies. So literature reviews are excellent sources. They can tell you quite a lot about a question because they're not limited to the results of just one single study. But they are a different kind of paper, so they tend to have a different kind of structure than an empirical study. And finally, the third kind are theory articles. Theory articles look at a topic through an interdisciplinary lens and restructure ideas in some new way. So a theory article, someone has zoomed kind of way out. They've looked at different empirical studies. They've probably looked at different literature reviews as well. And usually in a theory article, you're trying to establish a theory, which means you've got a new explanation for all these different findings and all these different results that are happening in your field or about a certain topic. So those are the three kinds of articles: empirical studies, literature reviews, and theory articles. Today, I'm just going to focus on empirical studies. But be aware that you may find literature reviews or theory articles as well, and they would have a different structure. But we'll look at empirical studies today. So one of the first things to understand is that empirical studies generally have the same basic structure. This is not 100% true, and it may be different depending on what field the paper was written in. But in general, at the beginning they'll have an abstract, which is a brief summary of the article. The abstract is a nice one-paragraph summary that tells you just what the whole article is about. And then the first section of the paper is usually called an introduction or a literature review. The introduction will usually kind of introduce the topic, perhaps talk about the research question or why the researchers decided to do this particular study. And they may also include a literature review, which means it'll have a small scale literature review where they've read other studies about this question, about this topic, usually to help inform the research that they did. The second section of the paper has different names. It could be called method, methodology, or study. And this is where the researchers tell you how they did the research. Did they do a survey? Did they do an experiment? Did they have a control group? Where was it done? When was it done? How did they gather their data? How did they analyze their data? Basically, it's what was the plan for the study. And if you want to do the study, if you want to repeat it, then the method section is what tells you how you can repeat the study for yourself. The third section is where the researchers share their findings, their results, or their data analysis. This section tends to have a lot of math, a lot of charts and graphs and tables, and a lot of very detailed discussion and explanation of the exact data that the researchers collected. And it tends to be fairly technical in this section, technical and mathematical. The next section is the discussion section. So in the discussion section, generally what they do is they take the findings, the data analysis, the results, and then they discuss what it means. Especially what does it mean in terms of their research question, of what they were trying to learn about. So the discussion section can be very helpful. It usually is a little less technical than the findings, results, and data analysis section. It doesn't often include all of the math, but it does tell you what all that math meant. And finally, there's a conclusion. The conclusion in an empirical study is usually short. They're usually 1 or 2 paragraphs. And in general, they might state very briefly what the findings of the study were, and then they often kind of make a suggestion for what should be studied in the future related to this topic. But the very, very end is where you'll find a reference list, the list of the writer's sources, just like you've been putting in your papers. So that's the basic structure of an empirical study. They all start with an abstract, and then they have an introduction, a section on methodology, a section on the data analysis, a discussion where they tell you what it all means, and a conclusion. So, as you consider this, as you consider the different sections of an empirical paper, one important part to ask yourself is what to read and what to skip. So, in general, a research paper, an empirical study, for the type of writing that you do in this class, in freshman composition, you don't have to read the entire article from start to finish, most likely. There will be a lot of information in there that you might not need for your purposes. And so one of the first things to understand is which parts should you read and which parts should you skip. And so this is my advice. You should read the abstract, the methodology, the discussion, and the conclusion. You should read the abstract at first because, like I said, it's a very quick summary. They'll give you an idea of what the article was about. Don't stop at the abstract, though. The abstract alone is not quite enough. You should read the method or methodology section because you want to know what the researchers did. You want to know very basically. You don't have to know in detail because you're not going to try to repeat this study, and you're probably not evaluating whether or not, this was a good study and should have been published. But you do want to basically know, how did they do their work? How did they try to answer the research question? You should read the discussion because, again, as I said before, that will show you what the results mean, what all that data that they gathered means. What's the significance and what answer did they find to their research question? The conclusion can be helpful to read. It's short, so it doesn't take much time to read. And again, they usually repeat their findings. They usually put it in a very simple 1 or 2 sentence. So you can be confident that you understood exactly what the findings of this study were. So my advice is that you should read the abstract, the methodology, the discussion, and the conclusion. You could skip, and this is a maybe, depending on the situation, you could skip the introduction and literature review. You could skip the findings, results, and data analysis, and you definitely could skip the references. I have some reasoning for this. So the introduction literature review, sometimes that can be helpful. There are a couple reasons. Sometimes the research question is in the introduction, and so you would want to find the research question. The literature review will give you a lot of background information on the topic. If you're still trying to learn more about your topic and still trying to maybe learn some of the terminology, the vocabulary, some of the important concepts related to your topic, kind of, giving a quick skim to the literature review could be helpful. The literature review could also help you find more sources. So it could do those things for you. So if you're looking, if you need to build your background knowledge or find more sources, then the literature review would be helpful. But if you're not, then you could skip that part. The findings, results, and data analysis, the reason why I suggest that you could skip it is usually, again, it's very technical. There's a lot of math. If you're a math person and math speaks to you, then it could be helpful. But remember that anything that's in the data analysis section will also be in the discussion. So if you skip the data analysis and you go straight to the discussion will tell you what it means without you having to kind of dig through all the data and all the math. And finally, the references list is just the list of their sources, so you don't need to read that. But if you find an interesting source in the literature review, then the references list will show you how to find it. It might provide you with like a DOI number or a URL, or at least a title and an author that you can search so you can find the source. But in general, if you're trying to be more efficient, you could maybe skip the introduction and literature review. You could probably skip the data analysis, and you definitely could skip the references section. So when we think about what to read and what to skip, we're thinking about what is it we need. Be strategic when we're reading these things. My goal for you in this class is basically just to get the gist. As you continue your education, there may be a time when your professors will really ask you to closely analyze and evaluate peer-reviewed academic research articles, but I'm not going to do that in this class. In this class, your goal is simply to use them as a source of information that you can use to help develop your thinking and support your arguments. So, I want you to get the gist. At minimum, you should be able to answer 3 questions. What was the research question? How did the researchers conduct their study? And what answers did the researchers find to their research questions? So the first question, what was the research question? You might find that in the introduction, or you might find that in the method section. For the second question, how did the researchers conduct their study? That you would definitely find in the method section. And again, when I say how did the researchers conduct their study, I want it very basic. You don't have to give me a whole lot of details about the number of participants and the theory that informed their methodology. It doesn't need to get that deep. Just very basic. Did they conduct a survey? Did they teach a class? Was it a laboratory experiment? Just something really basic like that. And finally, what answers did the researchers find to their research questions? What were their findings? And that you will probably find in the discussion and the conclusion. So here's an example of an empirical study that I read recently called Relating Narrative Inquiry and Inscription, Supporting Consequential Play. So what was the research question? I found that, I think, in the method section. They wanted to know how will 4th grade students respond to a multi-user virtual environment that incorporates a socio-scientific narrative and interactive rule sets. Of course, as I write my paper, I would probably have to give a little bit more explanation about what an MUV is, a multi-user virtual environment. What does this mean? Socio-scientific narrative, interactive rule sets. I'll have to provide some explanation for that in my paper. But as I just pull it out of the article, that was their question. How did the researchers conduct their study? So again, I found this in the method section. The researchers had 4th grade gifted students engage in a 10-day activity where they played a computer game called Quest Atlantis. And the researchers used both qualitative and quantitative techniques to gather data on the student response. So again, very simple. What did they do? They had students play a game, they observed, and they collected data on how the children responded to the game. The methodology section in this was actually quite long. This was a really complex methodology that they used. But, as I put this information in my paper, I can boil it down. My readers of my paper don't need a 3-page explanation on how they conducted this exact study. They just basically need to know they got some kids to play video games and they observed how the kids responded. What answers did the researchers find to their research questions? They found that the students participated actively and demonstrated comprehension of scientific principles. In other words, the students enjoyed the game and they learned a lot of science from it. And again, I got this from the discussion. The discussion in this paper was quite long as well. It was about like 5 or 6 pages long. But as I pull the gist out from my paper, basically I just need to say the kids learned. This was an effective technique for teaching. So this is one example of how you can just get the gist. So as you start looking at your own academic journal articles that you've found, I want you to, at minimum, just start with the gist. What was the research question? how did the researchers conduct their study, and what answers did the researchers find to their research question. If you can pull out those three things, you'll be doing great. And if you look in Canvas, I have an example. In the student models, I have an example of a student who wrote an excellent summary of academic journal articles. So I recommend getting in there and checking what that student wrote. It provides a really good model of how a student basically was able to answer these three questions and put them together into a paragraph. Couple last things here that I want to say. As you're reading, you should also be thinking about how you're going to use these academic articles in your writing. So if you have a goal in mind as you're reading, it'll help you read more effectively and efficiently, and it'll help you get the information that you need. So how can you use an academic journal article? You could use it as research to support an argument that you are making. So you've got your idea, your opinion, your argument, and then the findings of this study could help you support that argument. It could provide you with specific data, statistics, or facts to support an argument that you're making. It could provide you with an expert opinion or perspective to support the arguments that you're making. It could also be an example of a counter-argument. So if you find a source that seems to disagree with you, that's something you could include as a counter-argument. And of course, with a counter-argument, you always want to refute it. So you might want to show why you think that the findings of this research are invalid or maybe not relevant or something. And finally, a great way is to use this research paper as a source of other sources. Remember that in that introduction or literature review section, they will discuss a lot of other studies that have been done on the same topic. So if you give that a quick skim, you might be able to find yourself some other sources. And again, as you get deeper into your education, and as you read more and more academic literature like this will become more and more of a habit for you. You might actually spend a lot more time reading those literature reviews because you know that you just need to find more and more and more sources. So these are a couple ways that you could use, the strategy that you could use for these academic articles. But also a couple things that you should avoid, ways that I've seen that are not as effective. So one thing is using the conclusion of the paper, using the findings of the paper as the thesis for your essay. So I do not recommend doing that. Remember that you're trying to find these sources as one piece of supporting evidence. But if you take the conclusion, if you take the findings of a research paper and make it your thesis, you're essentially just going to summarize the research study. So our goal here is not to write a summary. Our goal here is for you to develop your own thesis, your own idea, and then go out and see whether or not that thesis is something that you can support. So you want to avoid having a paper that simply summarizes a study. And then finally, you want to avoid using a study as like a random bit of research data or expert opinion that's not clearly connected to the argument you're making. You are required to use sources, and academic sources are often considered the best, the gold standard. So sometimes what I see in student writing is that they just kind of take a quote or paraphrase some idea from an academic source, and they just plop it into their essay and say, I'm good, I'm done, I met that requirement. You want to avoid that. You want to be thoughtful and make sure that whatever, if you're going to summarize the findings of a study, if you're going to pull some important piece of data from the study or some opinion of the writers of the study, you want to make sure that it's really relevant to the point you are trying to make, the thesis that you're trying to support in your paper. So that's it for today's video lesson on how to read an academic journal article. Good luck. Happy reading.